Hi. So today, this is about from the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, the autobiography by Frederick Douglass. So, first thing I wanted to point out, this is an autobiography. So, like over here behind my corner is on the board, it's talking about autobiography versus memoir. As you probably know, the autobiography is the story of a person's life written by themselves, which is different from the biography, which is written by somebody else about their life. The autobiography versus a memoir, which some people are at least familiar with the term, even though they may not be able to define it. Some people may even be able to grasp that a memoir is also written by the person, and it's about the same person. So then what is the difference between an autobiography and a memoir? Well, it's kind of fuzzy, but the basics is an autobiography is from usually your childhood through your adult life, following the format of cause and effect. So this event caused me to do this, and then that caused me to do that, and then that caused me to do that, continuing along and so forth until the end of your story. Memoir, on the other hand, could just be one memory, which is totally fine. Or maybe a series of different memories, which is totally fine. A perfect example of a particular memoir may just be like a Holocaust survivor story. Like they're going to usually just tell us about that one period in time, like the Holocaust, and what they had to do and how they lived through that. That would be a memoir. And they might tell you a little bit of what happened after the life, maybe a little bit before that time period, but mostly it's about that one section of their life. So that's the basic difference between autobiography and a memoir. All right, next up, getting to the text itself. So in our textbook, it is on page 143. And if you actually go to page 144, the first part of what I would like to discuss is from lines 14 through 41. So if you could take a second, hit pause, reread lines 14 through 41, and I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. All right, so the purpose. What is the purpose of spending so much time, giving so much space, almost a full page, to this mistress, which just means his slave owner? She's obviously very important to him, or she had a profound impact. I don't know if he liked her or not. It sounded like at the beginning of it, she treated him very nicely, and so he must have liked her. She taught him to read. She treated him like a human being. Shocking, I know. And then later on, she kind of changed into the words from lamb-like to a tiger-like fierceness. And so she became really mean. And the description is that she even became worse than her husband, who was apparently quite mean. And so one of the worst things that he could do was make her more angry. What made her more angry was then to see me with a newspaper. And then later, in the very bottom, the last line is, to her satisfaction, that education and slavery were incompatible with each other. There's a big change here from her. So the question is, why? Why so much? Why does he put this in here? He's writing this in the mid-1800s, and it got published. And so most people that are going to read this are educated people. That's going to really narrow it down to white people, and probably mostly men. Women too, though. And so this is his audience. This is who's going to read this. So he's also, let me just back up here. So if you can think about this situation that they're in, 1850s, 40s, 1840s even. If you are the mistress, good intending, you have a slave, but you want to treat them nicely like a human being. First off, just owning them is not treating them like a human being. But she tries, And then she's up against this tidal wave that's against her. Because the entire United States society at this particular time is built with one group of people being better than another group of people by law. So even if you wanted to treat everybody nicely, it's incredibly difficult to do so. Legally, you can't, which is crazy, right? And then even if you're like, this is wrong, we shouldn't be doing this, but if everyone around you is doing it, and everyone around you is okay with it, it's very difficult to stand up to that. And it's really a whole lot easier to just go with the flow. Just go with it. Maybe just shut up, don't say anything. But that doesn't change anything. And of course, if I ask the question, does that make it right? Does that make slavery okay? The answer is, of course, no. Absolutely not. A society can, as a group, do bad things. Yeah, they just can. Even if you don't want to be doing those bad things. And you can easily be changed. I mean, look at this with her. I mean, that's so disheartening too, right? Because she wanted to do good, but then she turned into this thing that she didn't want to be. Also, to put this whole thing into perspective about slavery and issues with slavery, the purpose of his writing in this is that he wants to abolish slavery. There's a massive undertaking. As I know you're reading in your and talking in your social studies class, and I'll do it very briefly. You hear about the Civil War being about economics. That is part of it. And the economics of slavery is another huge piece of it. And what I mean by that is that so under slave times, slaves were considered property. Much like I own my house, and my house has value. And for me, like I can sell my home, take that money and do whatever I want. Or I can keep my home and I can do whatever I want to my home. I can kick the door in, I can fix the door, I can repaint it, I can add on to it, anything I want, right? Because it's mine. Sometimes it'll add value, sometimes it won't, but it's my personal choices. Slaves were also considered property. You could buy and sell them, and they were part of your wealth. Now, if you take the extreme example of being like a slave plantation owner, or a plantation owner with many, many, many slaves, first off, the slaves are part of your wealth. So even if you're okay with just getting rid of slavery, number one, you'd be getting rid of a ton of your wealth. Just gone. It would just evaporate. If you're like, no more slavery, well, you're giving away tons of your own money. Number two, you would lose your entire workforce that was doing all that work on the plantation for you. You could hire them back, which is what really a lot happened, but then you'd have to pay them. So you've lost your wealth, you had to hire people, and now you have to pay them. Like, you are not making as much money, and you're massively increasing the costs of these products. So the entire economy had to completely change. Not only that, so that's a huge chunk. Like, that's a huge shift, and people don't like to change, which, even in our world, we don't like to change that much because we're people too. And on top of that, the people in charge, they got to make these decisions, the lawmakers. At that point in time, they were all white men. And so you had to completely change the white male perspective in order to give up their power on purpose. They had to. And to me, that is massively hopeful. Like, that is huge. Like, that was huge. That was a big shift. And that's why they talk about it was a big shift. It was massive. So if we go back to Frederick Douglass in the book we're in. So if you look now on page 145, and if you would reread again from lines 49 to 76, 49 to 76 on page 145, please reread that. And while you're reading, think about how the attitudes are similar or different from the attitudes of the master and the mistress in the page before it. So how are the attitudes similar or different? Okay, I'm going to give you a few seconds. Pause this. Okay, and you're back. So if you look at this, what we should talk about here is he would go to town. He met these poor white boys. And there's a little bit of irony in that, right? Because he would get bread from his house. So then he was obviously very well fed, or fed enough that he didn't have to worry about food. But then he had enough extra that he could take it to these poor white kids. But yet he's a slave with lesser value, right? So there is an irony in that. And he would trade the bread for knowledge. He would trade them for the ability to read. And they would teach him. And so they did this over time, which is very interesting and cool. Also, if you look at the other part I'd like to point out is the quote he says at the bottom, where he's talking to these boys at that point in time. He says, "You will be free as soon as you are 21." So in our case, like 18, right? "But I am a slave for life." And so he let that sink in with them. He says, "Have I not as good a right to be free as you have?" And that's powerful, right? That's really powerful. He says, "These words used to trouble them. They would express to me the liveliest sympathy." They're like, "Yeah, you're right. You deserve to be free just as much as we are, but what can we do?" And console me with the hope that something would occur by which I might be free. So they wished that, yes, he would be free, that the conditions would change. Remember, Frederick Douglass is writing this to talk about the shift in the country that's happening. So even in his lifetime, to make a big shift like this, it takes a generation. And so he and many other people are obviously instilling in these young white boys that are approximately his same age this idea that, like, why am I not the same as you? And then later on in life, when these boys are grown up and are decision makers, they're saying, yeah, why aren't they just like everybody else? And so that is the power of change. It's a long-term change, but it is still change nonetheless. So I find that also quite interesting. All right, now if you would now flip to the page 146 and take a look at lines 84 to 92. Just quickly reread that. That's just going to take you a couple seconds. Hit pause. We'll be back in a second. Okay, we're back. The question is why is this dialogue so interesting to Douglass, and what effect may it have had on him? Think about that. I'd actually like to go on lower, down below lines 112, and below right there. Talking about his personal agony. There's a line. It's looked like it's line 115 roughly. He says, "I would at times feel that learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. It had given me a view of my wretched condition without remedy. It had opened my eyes to the horrible pit, but to no ladder upon which to get out. In moments of agony, I envied my fellow slaves for their stupidity." Reading, so important in this topic. He mentions it in that first part with the mistress who started to teach him to read, and then she stopped. And the thing that would get her really angry was that she would see him in the newspaper. This idea of reading is incredibly important. I mean, this whole idea of reading as power. Well, really, what kind of power is that? Is a big question. In this particular case, the type of power is you get knowledge, but it's a communication piece. 1850s, communication was you talked and you wrote letters. Maybe the telegraph. I don't think the telegraph's quite around yet, but these guys definitely didn't have access to the telegraph. So you could read the newspaper, and you could write letters to and from each people. So that was your modes of communication. Mostly, if you could read the newspaper, that'd be awesome. Because then if you read about abolitionists in the North, you might want to run north, and then you might escape. So slave owners had a reason to keep people not reading. They read about slave rebellions, decided to create a rebellion. Also a purpose to not want them to read. If you had the ability to read and write, you could get a better job and thus leave. Like especially if you escaped and you were an educated person. It's mostly this communication piece. If you can keep people in the dark, you can control them. That's it. Same in today's world. If you were unable to read and write, you'd be in the dark, and you'd be completely controlled by those around you, those with the knowledge of reading and writing, which is crazy, right? So, the very importance of our public education system, that everybody has the ability to read and write. Therefore, they do not have to be controlled by others. But I also could see, like, he is one of few at this point in time, slaves, or at this point in time when he's writing this, he was free African Americans that actually had the ability to read and write. The vast majority did not. And so I could see that being a very agonizing piece. Like, just brutal. Didn't have a lot of control over things. Like, he had control over some things, but he's like, I wish I just didn't know. If I didn't know, it'd be way better. So anyways, I hope you found this interesting. It's an interesting idea to be thinking about. If it's social studies, yeah, it's social studies, but it's also reading an autobiography, so reading something about a person who actually had a profound influence on the United States and our history. So, have a great day. We'll talk to you later.